Welcome, everybody. This is the first time we've ever done an online service without meeting, and it's all new to us. I'm sure we're going to figure out some things as we go, but we hate not being able to assemble, but we think it's as important that we continue to do what we do and try to stay in communication with everybody out there. And so I actually brought a few familiar faces. Maybe that'll help you feel a little bit more connected. And if this is the first time you're jumping in with us, what we've been studying is the book of Mark. So we can all go to Mark chapter 15 if you have your Bible. And we've been going through the Gospel of Mark for this past year. And just to kind of lead up into what's happening here, last couple of weeks we've looked at these two trials that were happening simultaneously. You had the trial of Jesus before the Sanhedrin, the religious leaders, and they believed Jesus was guilty of blasphemy. They believed that he had done something that was worthy of death. The other trial that was going on was outside in the courtyard, and that was with Peter. And Peter's trial was not a legal trial. It was really one that had more to do with his own personal life and his devotion to God. And would he be and remain devoted to Christ as he said he was going to be just hours before, and he proved that he was not. And the very last of Jesus' chosen disciples are gone. Jesus is left to deal with all of this by himself. And so it's like, well, now what? And there has to be a now what, because the Jews, they can't crucify someone. They can't kill someone because they're under the oppression of the Romans. So they have to go through the Roman government to do so. So that's where we pick up here in chapter 15, beginning in verse 1. So if one of you guys would like to read that for us, that'd be great.
As soon as it was morning, the chief priests had a meeting with the elders, scribes, and the whole Sanhedrin. After tying Jesus up, they led him away and handed him over to Pilate.
All right, so all of a sudden we see it's the whole council against Jesus, and they tie him up. And they're taking him to the Roman governor. And this is all prophesied. Jesus said these things are going to happen. In fact, if you want to look back to Mark chapter 10, verse 33, in fact, one of you around the table, if you'll read that for us, this is that prophecy.
Saying, "See, we are going up to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man will be delivered over to the chief priests and the scribes, and they will condemn him to death and deliver him over to the Gentiles."
I mean, it is just verbatim as to what's been happening. So we continue on. Somebody read verses 2 through 5 of chapter 15.
And Pilate asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And he answered him, "You have said so." And the chief priests accused him of many things. And Pilate asked him, "Have you no answer to make? See how many charges they bring against you." But Jesus made no further answer, so that Pilate was amazed.
All right. So let's just ask the question here. Do you think that the Roman governor really cares about what a Jewish group of religious leaders and them feeling like someone of their own people has blasphemed the Jewish God? Do you think that they care about this at all?
Well, I mean, as a former public official, looking at it like in that way, I don't think Pilate particularly cared about Jesus and didn't think Jesus was any kind of threat to him.
Right.
But he's governing these people, and if there's some way you can appease your folks and keep them from getting into a big rabble, you can do it. You do it. There's no skin off your back.
Yeah. And what's really interesting is, we looked at this trial before the Sanhedrin, the charge was blasphemy. But when we get here, Pilate is asking another question. It wasn't, did you blaspheme? Because the Sanhedrin knew they're going to have to get the attention of these Roman leaders. So what was it that would have gotten Pilate's attention?
Well, once again, if they're saying he's king of the Jews, that's his problem as a Roman governor.
Right.
Here's somebody that is claiming to take some authority maybe from Rome,
and take it on himself. And I think it's all going to come back at the end, too, when we talk about Barabbas.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, this was the only way they're really going to see someone's worthy of a death penalty in the case of Jesus is they're going to have to see that he is a threat to the Roman sovereign. And they try to put this out there, and they call him the King of the Jews. First time we see this in the Gospel of Mark. And it's an interesting charge. And the reason is that, I mean, we've seen this and we've heard, this charge and so forth, but there was already one who was deemed King of the Jews before Jesus, and it was Herod the Great. And that was in 40 BC. And in 4 BC, when he dies, Caesar Augustus did not even give that title of king to any of his sons. So this is a pretty major thing, the charge that they're making here. And this really becomes the focal point of chapter 15, of the crucifixion and everything else. Because six times throughout chapter 15, we'll see, I think, maybe 3 of those today, this charge of King of the Jews is brought up. And what we'll see next week is we'll get into the mockery of the soldiers, and the mockery is all about him being a king. And we see this, and it's like very offensive, but I think Mark is underlining something for us because he uses it so often, and we've seen this with Mark. Mark loves to get our attention, and I think he's showing that this is the place where Jesus is going to be enthroned. It's here. We think of enthronement or an inauguration in a different place, but Mark is showing us something that absolutely goes against what we think of in the concept of a king. And it begs the question, I think, is why don't these writers, like the Gospels and even later in the New Testament, why don't they just downplay the idea of a suffering, crucified king? Why do you think that they add this in here and make sure that we get it?
Well, it's an important part of the story.
Yeah.
So we need to know what was going on and how everyone felt at that point.
Yeah. And I think more important than just that is the fact that this is the enthronement. This is going to be the enthronement. And Mark, when you see Mark doesn't shy away from it. I mean, all along the way, he has just kept putting this before us. And it presents the Son of God's death as victory. It's a victory over sin. It's a victory over the evil one. It's a victory over death. And that's very important, I think, in our time. And while we're meeting here, a lot of people are out there and they're afraid of death. And here Jesus is being seen as the one who conquers it. He conquers it, no matter what happens in our life. But let's continue on. Somebody read for us verses 6 through 15.
At the festival, it was Pilate's custom to release for the people a prisoner they requested. There was one named Barabbas who was in prison with rebels who had committed murder during the rebellion. The crowds came up and began to ask Pilate to do for them. The crowd came up and began to ask Pilate to do for them as was his custom. So Pilate answered them, "Do you want me to release the King of the Jews for you?" For he knew it was because of envy that the chief priests had handed him over. But the chief priests stirred up the crowd so that he would release Barabbas to them instead. Pilate asked them again, "Then what do you want me to do with the one you call the King of the Jews?" Again they shouted, "Crucify him." Then Pilate said to them, "Why? What has he done wrong?" But they shouted, "Crucify him," all the more. Then willing to gratify the crowd, Pilate released Barabbas to them. And after having Jesus flogged, he handed him over to be crucified.
Who is this guy Barabbas? Or maybe let's ask this question: why are they shouting for Barabbas? Really doesn't say a whole lot except what?
Well, it said the chief priest stirred up the crowd.
Yeah. So they're stirring up the crowd. But what we find here, there's a lot of irony in this situation, and we've seen this with Mark. Mark loves irony. And so, who is Barabbas? Let's just look at that real quickly. How does it describe him?
He's a murderer.
He's a murderer. What else?
Well, he calls them rebel.
Rebel.
Yeah, a rebel, an insurrectionist. I have that in there as well. So here's a guy who is a rebel, and he is a murderer. And he is going to go free, and Jesus is going to take his place on the cross, because that was the cross that was supposed to be for Barabbas. So what is the irony that we see for ourselves in what's happening in this prisoner exchange, I guess?
Well, here's someone who has taken life, who is not a great person from the information that we have here. And then there is Jesus, who is literally taking his spot,
Yeah.
just like he did for us.
Yeah. Anybody else? I think she may have hit it pretty good there. But yeah, okay. So think about, we use this word sometimes in Christianity, atonement. That's just a big word, and it's not something we use. But if you want to know really what atonement is, this is it. It is changing out the life of someone who's innocent and taking the place of someone who's guilty. And when we think of the cross, this is what's happening. Jesus goes and he drinks the cup of judgment. He's the one who goes and he takes the death for sinfulness. And so this is what it's about. In fact, Romans 5:8. I know I asked one of you to read it. Read that passage for us, please.
But God shows his love for us, that while we are still sinners, Christ died for us.
All right. See, while we were sinners, Christ died. It wasn't just Barabbas. Barabbas just becomes a symbol for us. 1 Peter 3:18.
For Christ also suffered for sins once for all, the righteous for the unrighteous, that he might bring you to God, after being put to death in the fleshly realm, but made alive in the spiritual realm.
All right. So Christ suffered for sins, the righteous for the unrighteous, right? And to bring us to God. So the crowd chooses the one who has taken the life of another out of his own selfish rebellion, and the other is the one that they want to go to the cross, is the one who's willing to give his life for others out of full obedience and submission to the Father. And so the irony is all around. Barabbas is a name. It comes from a Hebrew word that means son of the Abba, or son of the Father. And it's believed to kind of be the family ancestral name, maybe of his father or another ancestor. But his given name is given to us in Matthew, and I'm going to read it. It's out of the Lexham English Bible, and it says, and at that time, this is Matthew 27, 16, 17. And at that time, they had a notorious prisoner named Jesus Barabbas. So after they had assembled, Pilate said to them, "Whom do you want me to release to you, Jesus Barabbas or Jesus who is called Christ?" Now, not all translations, in fact, I use the English Standard Version, does not include the word Jesus. It's not found in all of the manuscripts, and so some think maybe it shouldn't be in there. There are others who disagree, and they say it doesn't make sense that something like this would be added. But we're going to assume here that this is true, that Barabbas, his surname is Jesus. I mean, when you think about that, it heightens the drama of what Pilate asked, doesn't it? So basically, what is he asking?
You got two Jesuses. Make a choice.
Yeah. Which Jesus do you want? That's That's pretty unbelievable. And here's the thing. It's one of those things that, for us, we think, well, that's simple. We want Jesus the Christ. But I think when we really look back at Barabbas, I think we have to take a closer look before we really answer that question for ourselves. Because here's someone who was, in the Jewish mindset, this was a freedom fighter. Remember, these people are being oppressed by the Romans. This guy is willing to take life so that the Jewish people can have more freedom. That's really what this comes down to. So let me ask you this, what did the Jewish people think that the Messiah that was to come into the world, that the prophecy spoke about, what were they hoping was going to come?
That he would be a ruler. He would be a warrior, a god, and that he would come down with an iron cloud and this is what we're going to do. This is how it's going to be.
Yeah. If you remember, they were ready to make Jesus king after the feeding because they saw him as someone great power. They wanted someone who was going to get them out of the oppression of the Roman government and all the things that they've had to deal with, if you know much about those relationships as well. So they were kind of looking for this Messiah king in this way. So, it's like, do they really want someone who's not willing to resist evil or this oppression with violence? And I don't think that was in their terminology or in their mindset that this is the kind of person they would want. So when you hold up a Barabbas, a freedom fighter, and you hold up a Jesus who is a ministry of peace and willing to just die, you can see the struggle. So let's ask ourselves this question. When we look for leaders, and this could be in whether government or whatever it may be, what do we normally look for in leaders?
I think it's strong personality of somebody that can put themselves out there in front of other people.
Yeah.
In public and things like that.
Yeah. We look for somebody who's strong. We look for somebody who can fight our battles, who will lead us into battle, who will fight for our pursuit of happiness, right? And be able to squash our enemies, And you could use that even in metaphorical fashion in all of this as well. So rebels like Barabbas, they were persistent. And eventually, and if you read the history of the Romans, these guys continued to do this. There would be this uprising until finally the Roman government would send in troops and they would either squash it or there was an all-out war. And there was a war coming, and Jesus has actually talked about that back in chapter 13. But does any of y'all understand what was going to happen in AD 70?
The destruction.
Yeah, there's going to be a siege on Jerusalem because there were these rebels who kind of kicked them out a couple of years before that, and they destroyed Jerusalem. They destroyed the temple. Most of the people who lived in Jerusalem, Jewish people, they were killed. It was really a terrible time. And for the Sanhedrin, they believed Jesus was a threat to the temple. I mean, we've heard it in some of these accusations. He says, he's going to destroy the temple. But yet, they're wanting released the very kind of person that is eventually going to destroy the temple. The rebel who's going to continue to fight until finally these things are brought down. And so, Jesus is not like a king of the world. His kingdom is not like the kingdoms of the world. He doesn't conquer kingdoms. He's not set up in the ancient lands. He's not set up in America. He is in every nation. He's like he's like the opposite of the coronavirus, right? The positive of the coronavirus. I mean, he's in every kingdom of the world. And his kingdom is just so much different. And he's not He never planned to be king of the Jews only. His goal and the purpose of the Father was that he would be the king of all kings. And it's a different kind of kingdom. And it's a different kind of person that we choose when we choose this Jesus. In fact, chapter 8 and verse 34, Jesus tells us what it means to be a disciple of Jesus. You have that?
8:34. And calling the crowd to him with his disciples, Jesus said to them, if anyone would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me.
A denial of self, a taking up of a cross. Jesus' way soaks up injustice and evil and oppression, and it unleashes a more powerful force of love and forgiveness. And I think this is also very important in our time right now, in our world with everything that's going on, is to understand what we are to unleash in this world. And the kingdoms of the world, they're struggling to stop this, but Jesus is trying to bring about a greater force. And I think that's so important. And so, as we get ready to conclude here, I simply want us to think about, who it is we really choose. Do we look for Jesus, Barabbas, the freedom fighter, the people who are always going to fight for our rights? Or are we looking for the one who is willing to give his life? And he calls us to be a people who follow him and be willing to give our lives. And rather than going out and oppressing people in a time like we're in, for example, we go out and we serve others. And we share the things that we have and with the people who are in need. It's a different kind of kingdom. And so, as we end here, we think about who we are and what we have in Jesus Christ. That he took our place where we were the Barabbas. We've been rebels in our lives. We're people who maybe we haven't murdered, but we certainly could add our own sins in there. And we see that that's the Jesus that we really love and we really want to follow and emulate in our lives. Thank you for joining us.